if you're gonna stay on the line, right? Or do you want to go now? Do you want me to do?
Yeah, no, it's your show.
Okay.
She wants to be part of it.
All right, Claudia, okay. I'm ready to go.
There we go.
Thank you very much.
All good.
Okay, great. Excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right, thank you for
Maybe
having
we'll start
me.
with the same slide. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I mean, it's just gonna stay like that. I don't have any PowerPoint. Okay. So thank you for having me. I wanted to talk about, as I said, anti-Zionist anti-Semitism and its impact on young people and Holocaust memory. A recent headline in the NBC News found that the survey finds shocking lack of Holocaust knowledge among millennials and Gen Z. Another one reads, this time from The Guardian, nearly 2/3 of US young adults are unaware that 6 million Jews were killed during the Holocaust. Recent surveys by Pew Research Center and Claims Conference have both found that knowledge of the Holocaust is in decline, particularly among younger generations. The findings of these various surveys cause a great deal of concern, not just among those of us who teach and study genocide, but the wider population. As Holocaust survivors continue to dwindle, the importance of memory becomes paramount. These results are particularly disturbing as they come at a time when Holocaust education, long thought to be the remedy, has become mainstream in states in the United States and a number of other places. In addition to surveys on Holocaust knowledge, those that look specifically at anti-Semitism, like the ADL's Survey of American Attitude Towards Jews, show that a lack of Holocaust knowledge helps shape attitudes towards Jewish people in the United States. For example, in the United States, not only did a recent survey find that anti-Semitism has been steadily on the rise, but that, quote, nearly 1 in 5 Americans, or 19%, believe that, quote, Jews still talk too much about what happened to them in the Holocaust. While much of the analysis seeking to address this problem emphasizes the need for education and focus on testimony and memory, very little work has been done to understand the ways in which anti-Zionist anti-Semitism, a modern form of anti-Semitism that we'll discuss a lot here at the conference and largely found on the political left, contributes to the lack of Holocaust knowledge and creates susceptibility to Holocaust denial among young people. This paper attempts to uncover the ways in which anti-Zionist anti-Semitic views may contribute to this lack of knowledge, and also consider the ways we may be able to step up and even to stop and even reverse this trend by analyzing these political views as a potential cause of Holocaust ignorance and misinformation. The paper argues the importance of the specific inclusion of education on all modern forms of anti-Semitism while teaching about the Holocaust as a way to actively and truly combat Holocaust denial in the present day and promote accurate Holocaust memory and knowledge for future generations. Making the case that anyone is engaging in Holocaust denial is a serious charge, which is emotive and fraught with pitfalls. This is particularly true when looking at the actions of those who consider themselves to be anti-racist that vehemently deny such charges. This is why it's important to first look at the ways in which denial as an essentially contested sociological concept has developed before we consider the way in which anti-Zionist anti-Semitism can descend into Holocaust denial. In his work, The Elephant in the Room, Silence and Denial in Everyday Life, sociologist Aviatar Zerubbabel looks at the ways in which silence and denial are already embedded in much of our modern culture. These conspiracies of silence have properties that are formalized and institutionalized within society, and therefore collaborative in nature. Looking specifically at denial surrounding atrocities and suffering, Stanley Cohen's States of Denial considers the ways in which it works at a personal level, but especially at the societal level. All denial is not of the same type. There are 3 main forms of denial according to Cohen: literal, interpretive, and implicatory. When considering Holocaust denial, the following could be examples of each type. Literal denial could be someone saying the Holocaust never happened. Interpretive denial may be someone saying the Holocaust happened, but not in the way that you think it did. And implicatory denial might be a person saying the Holocaust happened, but there are more important things to think about. Additional clarification can be had by considering the framework created by Israel Charny in his work, A Classification of Denials of the Holocaust and Other Genocides. He attempts to create what he calls a comprehensive model of different types of denial. And according to Charney's classification, there are 6 major types of denial with multiple subtypes. There's malevolent denial, which is a perpetrator denying because of bigotry. Self-serving opportunism, that's denial in the service of personal, professional, political gain. Innocent denials, where people are said to just be asking questions, manipulating the evidence. Definitionalism, which are pedantic disavowals of defining cases of genocide through numbers, games, and semantics. And nationalistic hubris of self-involvement, which justifies the exclusion of others. That's denial which downplays the genocide through not knowing, not caring, and human shallowness is the final one through banalization or fetishization of atrocity. After considering both Cohen and Charney's frameworks, it's useful to turn towards even more recent work, which helps us tackle the complex topic of Holocaust denial and its relationship to anti-Zionist anti-Semitism. This is found in the work of historian Deborah Lipstadt, Anti-Semitism Here and Now. Lipstadt is best known for her work on anti-Semitism, Holocaust denial, and winning against David Irving's attempt to sue her for libel. In this book, she looks at different types of denial that she defines as hardcore and softcore denial. The section on hardcore denial tackles arguments of the neo-Nazi revisionist and Holocaust denial, such as that the gas chambers didn't exist, claims that Hitler didn't know about the final solution, and Frank's diary is a fake. This type of denial is a combination of Cohen's literal denial and interpretive denial, as well as the first 4 types of 6 types highlighted by Charney. This hardcore denial is more easily recognizable as denial and has traditionally been associated with revisionist, conservative, far-right, and anti-Semitic views. While hardcore denial has been gaining traction on social media in recent years through meme culture and other avenues, it's important to consider the ways in which these right-wing beliefs and arguments have resurfaced for new generations and may have undue influence upon them. And indeed, many scholars are currently doing that work. However, younger generations that continue to show an increasing lack of Holocaust knowledge skew heavily to the left of the political spectrum, according to the research that has been done. Presumably, these generations will be less susceptible to right-wing memes and arguments. So what might appeal to younger left-leaning people? Let's explore this by looking at anti-Zionist anti-Semitism itself. Like denial, both anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism are essentially contested concepts, and therefore difficult to define. However, for the purposes of what we're discussing here, we want to see the ways in which anti-Semitism can present itself in the arguments of the modern anti-Zionist movement that have a material impact on Holocaust memory and knowledge. In David Hirsch's work, Contemporary Left Anti-Semitism, he notes that if anti-Semitism is understood as racism, then the understanding as it is applied to other forms of racism should mean that what matters is, quote, what people do and what consequences their actions have, what is materially acted out, as well as the result of that action. And that's the important part of understanding the harm done by anti-Semitism as a form of racism, regardless of the source of that behavior. Hirsch utilizes the work of Ben Cohen, who referred to differing types of anti-Semitism that, similar to Lipstadt's definition of denial, have both hard and soft versions. These are defined as beer killer and bistro anti-Semitism. According to Hirsch's interpretation of Cohen, beer killer anti-Semitism is violent, abusive, vulgar, and explicitly fueled by hatred, whereas bistro anti-Semitism is polite, civil, and sophisticated. Anti-Zionist anti-Semitism sits in the bistro space and allows a form of anti-Semitism to creep into mainstream society in a more acceptable manner. Hirsch continues, quote, this type of anti-Semitism is not the first radical anti-Semitism to position itself as siding with the oppressed against most of the Jews. Hirsch attempts to provide a definition of modern anti-Zionism as something that began as a critique of the political movement for national self-determination, and after the Holocaust and the establishment of the State of Israel became a movement to abolish an existing nation state, which then, quote, matured into a worldview which repositions Jewish wrongdoing at the center of all that is problematic in the world. Returning to Lipstadt and her concept of softcore denial, she points out that many forms of softcore denial are intertwined with anti-Semitism and include things like inverting the morality of the Holocaust, comparing Jews to Nazis, and claiming Jews were collaborators. Much of this type of softcore denial has been found on the political left in recent years, as we know. Softcore denial includes inverting victims and perpetrators and Holocaust inversion, which was covered. It's a form of softcore denial that switches the position of Jewish victims of the Holocaust with the Nazis, Leslie Clack has explored that, and it's defined as involving an aversion of a reality that Israelis are cast as the new Nazis, and the Palestinians are cast as the new Jews, and an aversion of morality as well. The Holocaust is presented as a moral lesson or even a moral indictment of the Jews, i.e. they should know better. This type of denial is both anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic in character, and as such can be said to be an example of anti-Zionist anti-Semitism that descends into Holocaust denial. Another type of softcore denial is branding victims as collaborators. This includes making false claims that Jews collaborated with the Nazis during the Holocaust to further their goals of creating a Jewish, Zionist state, and therefore were active participants in the expulsion and destruction of their own people. The arguments that the realization of the Zionist goal of a national homeland for the Jewish people in the state of Israel was a result of collaboration with the Nazis and therefore fascist creation is an anti-Zionist, anti-Semitic argument that discourages factual knowledge and information about the Holocaust. The final type of software denial that looks at is de-Judaizing the Holocaust. This type of modern denial is utilized primarily by nation states to downplay their roles in the Holocaust and to punish historians and others who speak the truth about what occurred. Most recently, this has been seen in Hungary and Poland. It is also a legacy of the Soviet Union's attempts to downplay the Jewish character of the Holocaust in its territory and its own legacy of anti-Zionism that materially functioned as anti-Semitism against Jews in the Soviet Union. These types of modern denial are wrapped up intimately with anti-Zionist anti-Semitism. If one truly believes that Israelis are the new Nazis, that Jews were collaborators through the Zionist project in their own genocidal deaths for the sake of creating the state of Israel, and the Jews have exaggerated the claims of mistreatment by various nation states and people during the Holocaust, it is not altogether surprising that there is a waning interest in the Holocaust among younger generations who see themselves as torchbearers of progressive causes. If Jews are equated with this type of evil, then it is unsurprising that statements like Jews still talk too much about what happened to them in the Holocaust can be agreed to by so many. It is wholly unsurprising the knowledge of the Holocaust continues to decline. Why study Jews who are the cause of their own sorrows as opposed to more innocent victims of genocide? When anti-Semitic attacks occur, why should we be as concerned given that Jews may themselves be responsible for those attacks through their behavior, whether that behavior entails being a Zionist or merely wearing a symbol of Judaism like a kippah? Most attempts to combat denial and declining knowledge of the Holocaust have revolved around the push for mandatory Holocaust education and an increased drive to capture survivor testimony in various archives to further educate the public. This is undoubtedly very important work. However, this is clearly not enough. As noted by Noah Schenker in his Embodied Memory, one difficulty with Holocaust memory in the United States in particular is that much of the Holocaust memory in museums and archives leans towards serving the purpose of providing a universal redemptive message. The problematic nature of this approach is that it does not increase knowledge of the Holocaust as it really was, but rather uses it as a tool for messages about redemption, hope, and triumph over adversity. It ends up universalizing the Holocaust and becomes a feel-good story divorced from the disassociative horror of the real thing. We can see how the universalization of the Holocaust message as a historical lesson of good versus evil can divorce it from the issue of not only historical anti-Semitism, but modern forms of anti-Semitism that reach back to minimize the horror through both softcore and implicatory denial. This increased universalization and banalization, along with increasing prevalence of softcore denial, makes for a toxic combination. To conclude, given that education and memorialization appears to only have had partial success, we must urgently consider the ways in which we can further mobilize to stop declining Holocaust knowledge. It is not enough to provide education on the Holocaust as an historical event, but to answer the question of why it should still matter to younger generations. A key part of this is countering anti-Zionist anti-Semitism openly and unapologetically when it descends into softcore denial, particularly as this form of modern anti-Semitism cloaks itself in anti-racist and progressive language that appeals to young people. To do that, we must incorporate specific modules, materials, and analyses that help explain modern forms of anti-Semitism into every single Holocaust education course, every memorial, and every museum and archive. It is not enough to consider anti-Semitism's impact on and understanding of the Holocaust as a question of mere historical interest. Thank you very much.